Hi there and welcome. My name is Gauthier Choquet and I am a Microsoft Technical Trainer. In this video, we will explore migrating SQL Server workloads to Azure SQL Managed Instance. The PaaS solution combines the best features of SQL Server with the benefits of a fully managed service, including automated backups, built-in high availability, and seamless scaling. You will learn how to migrate SQL Server database using tools like the Azure SQL Migration Extension for Azure Data Studio, the Data Migration Assistant, and methods like backup and restore. By the end of this module, you will be equipped with a plan and execute a migration from on-premises SQL Server to Azure SQL Managed Instance, addressing both of the technical and the business requirements. So let's get started with our journey into the world of SQL Server migration to Azure SQL Managed Instance. So first of all, what is the Azure SQL Managed Instance? The Azure SQL Managed Instance is part of the Azure SQL Platform as a Service or PaaS solution designed to offer a fully managed PaaS experience for SQL Server application in Azure. It facilitates the lift and shift solution, allowing databases and supporting technologies to migrate to Azure without requiring extensive modifications. Why do we want to choose the Azure SQL Managed Instance? Well, Azure SQL Managed Instance provides multiple benefits. Backward compatibilities, which support SQL Server 2008 database and allow for direct migration from SQL Server 2005, updating the compatibility level as needed. Also, we have the easy lift and shift. We support and guarantee almost 100% compatibility with SQL Server, including core component, instance scope features, and management tools. It's a fully managed PaaS solution, which means that it eliminates the needs of the underlying hardware management and physical maintenance, offering a quick scalability and up-to-date SQL features. We have security features, enabling advanced security settings such as the vulnerability assessment, advanced threat protection, the transparent data encryption, the TDE, and the BYOK, bring your own key for encryption. Also, the secure network isolation provide complete network isolation, exposing the managed instance through the private IP addresses, accessible only via the private Azure or hybrid networks. And then we also have the instance failover group. It's managing a set of databases that can fail over as a unit to another region, ensuring high availability and disaster recovery. Now, how do we use the Azure SQL Managed Instance? Well, the Azure SQL Managed Instance is ideal for scenarios requiring minimal modification of existing databases and applications. Also allows for seamless migration to the cloud while maintaining functionality and the performance of an on-premise SQL Server. So it makes it perfect for business-critical databases, such as those used in the retail company to manage product details, sales, representative apps, and data analysis solutions. By leveraging the Azure SQL Managed Instance, businesses can ensure real-time data synchronization, high availability, and security while reducing the overhead of hardware management and maintenance. There are two modes of migration to the Azure SQL Managed Instance, the online mode and the offline mode. The online mode has minimal or no downtime, while the offline mode experiences downtime during the migration process. You can see multiple options on the screen here. We have the log replace services, so it's an online migration option that offers more control over the database migration project. The second, we have the Azure SQL Migration Extension for Azure Data Studio. It's a tool that helps to prepare for migration SQL Server databases to Azure, ideally for small to medium-sized databases and supporting online migration to SQL Managed Instance. Then we have the Managed Instance link. It uses distributed availability groups to replicate data almost instantly between the SQL Server and then the Azure SQL Managed Instance. Then we have the native backup and restore. It is a simple migration method used for full database backup and restore to the Azure storage account. Next, we have the transactional replication. It will continuously move the data between connected database and servers. It is a solution that supports both online and offline migration, and it is optimized for larger and complex databases. While most of those tools facilitate migration to the Azure SQL database as well, some are exclusively supported by the SQL Managed Instance. So let's have a closer look at those tools in a whiteboard discussion.
All right, now that we have seen some of those migration options, then let's go a little bit deeper on some of those. So I'm going to start with the log replay service. All right, so very good options that we have as well with it. So let's ask a question, as to Copilot. So why should I consider using log replay services for database migration to Azure? Right, to add a little bit more context on that one, I'm going to copy the question and send it to our little friend Copilot. All right, so same question out there. Let's see. So I'm expecting to have, talking about the data integrity, downtime, size of the database support, and so on, right? And even the synchronization. But let's see, right? Because those are the benefits that we have coming from the log replay service. So let's have a look. Adding some categorization here, we can see it. All right, perfect. So let's have a look. Risk management, minimize downtime risk. Well, potentially yes, right? So that's one of the benefits coming from it. Improve reliability, data handling for consistency of our data. Incremental changes, well, yes, because potentially we have multiple mode is something I'm going to mention in a few as well. Process optimization, streamline the migration process, yes, and performance in mind. This is exactly some of the benefits that we have with it. So let's add some visualization as part of it. So I'm going to move that one a bit here. And fairly interesting, right? So this is actually how that works. So the log replay service, or you may see it or hear it as LRS, log replay service. So it's actually a tool that enables custom migration of databases from on-premises SQL servers to SQL Managed Instance in Azure, right? So it uses log shipping technology and is useful in cases where you need more control over the migration, okay? And also when having just a little bit of downtime is okay, or actually when the Azure data migration services is not an option for us to use. Okay, so there's actually two mode available for it. So we have the active or the passive mode, right? So on the left, we have some information about the passive mode, and on the right, with the active workload. So the difference is that with the active workload, where we do continuous synchronization of the backup that is being taken. Okay, so very interesting option that we are available as one of our options, as mentioned. So now let's continue. And then next, we're going to talk about the manage instant link. So now let's provide some information about the manage instance link. Okay, so again, let's ask question here. Why should I consider using Azure SQL Managed Instance link feature? That's a great question. Once again, let's send it to Copilot for providing some recommendation for it. What do we expect to have? Well, again, gonna probably talk about the backup, its migration, adding categorization for that question here, and then performance and scalability, right? That's usually the key component that we want to hear when we talk about the migration. So here you go, availability and recovery, high availability and disaster recovery. Well, yes, it's one of the key point actually from the managed instance link. We're gonna discuss that as part of our visualization. Cost efficiency, right? So it's a cost-effective solution. Well, yes, right? Potentially, I'm not going to talk much about the cost because it depends on multiple components, right? Depends on what type of connection you have between your on-premise location, the size of the database, the target endpoint that you pick, and all of this, right? So great discussion that you need to have. Maintaining costs in mind is definitely something that you want to maintain, especially when you do migration. So we provide some insight on those on the first module of our session that can help, maintain cost in mind through the assessment. Okay, should we be aware kind of a range related to the cost of how much that solution will cost once we migrate the database in Azure? Definitely yes. Having a range on it is important. Security features, enhanced security features, yes, because of the on how that works on the back end. Integration and maintenance. Okay, what do we have as part of this? Maintenance and updates, yes, because it's update as a single cluster. We're going to see that. Scalability and flexibility, because we can extend this, and seamless integration with Azure services. Well, interesting component that we have out there. So now let's add some visualization, which is that one here. I'm going to move that a little bit on the left to be consistent with our whiteboard. So what do we have here? So the Azure SQL Managed Instance link features enables seamless hybrid connectivity between, let's say, your on-premises server that you have and the Azure SQL Managed Instance. Okay, so it's very interesting. It's a great feature for those type of scenarios, especially the scenarios that require minimum downtime and near real-time data synchronization. So it allows for easy scaling and high availability, making it an excellent choice for modernizing your database while ensuring business continuity. Next, we're going to talk about another option, which is the native backup and restore. Okay, so we already provided some benefits on it. So let's go straight to the a good visualization that we have. There you go. To explain how that works. Okay, so visualization is fairly straightforward. So it's one of the key capabilities of the Azure SQL Managed Instance is to enable quick and easy database migration with the native restore of the database backup. Okay, so basically what you do is that from your source SQL Server, we can imagine that this could be on-prem, for example, right? So we generate that backup file, that .bak, and then you can store them as part of an Azure storage account, right? You backup directly, potentially, from you backup to that URL pointing to the storage account, or you move the backup file to that storage account, and then you restore directly from that backup file to that managed instance here. Okay, so it's very interesting. This method is also supported by the SQL Server running on Azure VM. Okay, so it's a double win for this option here. Now, let's continue with another one. I mean, another situation or scenario, because in some migration scenarios, you may need to maintain the connection that you have with your on-prem location, right? And Azure database. So for example, there may be instances where the client updates both database at the same time, right? So you can have some database for application on-prem and subset of database on Azure directly. Where, what's very interesting about those is that potentially here we can see the on-prem, right? This is what we have, the on-prem custom application and tools. Depending, before you choose the data synchronization method, is important to ensure that you have a good connectivity, like between your on-prem and the Azure location. And also, when I say good connectivity, I'm talking about performance in mind, but also security, right? To having a secure and performant connection between your on-prem location and then the Azure. So it's very interesting. There's different type of connection. This is not really the scope of our session here, but between your on-prem, you can have potentially on-prem point to site, site to site VPN, which are encrypted connection, and then also the express route, which is a dedicated connection that you have between dedicated and private connection that you have between your on-prem location and then the Azure as an endpoint here. Now, again, why should we use public endpoint for SQL Managed Instance? Well, that could be a great question to ask. Well, let me zoom out a little bit. The public endpoint here for SQL Managed Instance, it helps you to connect to the database from the internet without using a VPN, right? I repeat, it's helping you to connect to the database from the internet without having a VPN in place here. Okay, so it's used for data communication only. And then when we talk about security reason, right? So the implementation of it allows for another topic, which is the separation of duties, right? The SOD. So the separation of duties between the database administrator and the network administrator when you enable that public endpoint here. All right. So we have seen multiple options in a little bit more detail. Now let's go back to the presentation.
To connect application to a SQL Managed Instance, the instance must be deployed within a dedicated Azure Virtual Network and subnet. This setup ensures that a secure private IP address and facilitate the connectivity with the on-premises network. Connection to the Managed Instance database can be established using different methods, including the Azure Portal, PowerShell, Azure CLI, and REST API. All communications are secured and authenticated with certificates, meaning that the managed instance have a trust and continuously validate the certificate using certificate revocation list to ensure the integrity of the connection. If a certificate is found to be revoked, then the SQL managed instance will terminate the connection to safeguard its data. All right, so we have seen most of those already. So depending on which SQL option you pick, you have access to multiple tools for migration. Let's continue with the transactional replication. So the transactional replication is a method for transferring data between connected databases. The process starts with capturing a snapshot of the publication database object and the data. After the initial snapshot, any change to the data or the schema at the publisher are typically delivered to Azure SQL Managed Instance in almost real time. SQL Managed Instance offers flexibility as it can function as both the publisher and the distributor, but also as a subscriber. Replication is unique as it allows the replication of a specific part of a table. This data is then transmitted to a distributor, which supplies to any numbers of subscribers. Then we have the bulk copy or the bulk copy program, the BCP. So the BCP utility is a command line tool that facilitates the export of tables to files for import scenario. This method can be used to migrate data between single database and SQL Managed Instance as well as the opposite. Then we have the Azure Data Factory or ADF. Azure Data Factory specializes in data movement and orchestration, focusing primarily on data ingestion. But the ADF also supports running the SSIS packages via its integration runtime and allows public internet access for SQL Managed Instance. All right, so in this demo, we'll learn on how to migrate a SQL Server database to SQL database using the Azure migration extension for Azure Data Studio. We will start by installing and launching the Azure migration extension. We will then perform an offline migration of a SQL Server database to Azure SQL database. Then you will learn on how to monitor the migration process via the Azure portal. This exercise is designed to be completed in about 45 minutes. So let's go ahead and begin the journey of migrating the SQL Server database to Azure SQL database.
All right, welcome to this new demo where we're going to be doing the migration from an existing SQL database to an Azure SQL database. So for that, we're going to be leveraging multiple components and resources. So first, what we're going to be doing is creating as we did on previous demo, creating a database locally, right, based on an existing backup file. Then after that, we're going to create an empty Azure SQL database on Azure. And then through the Azure Data Studio, we're going to do its migration. So let's get started. And let's go ahead and open the SQL Management Studio to create that database. So I'm going to create it, connect to it. Okay, as we can see, there's no databases. So first, what we're going to do is that from the existing backup file that I collected here proactively, so I created a folder called DP-3001 and place my backup file out there. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing is that I am going to run, as we did on previous demo, the SQL statement here to restore that specific database. I will just update the folder name, pointing to my DP-3001. DP-3001. Let's continue here for the MDF file, so the data file, 3001. Let's run it. Completed. Okay, so let's refresh the database, making sure it got imported. Perfect, we have it out there. So remember, this database has multiple tables. I'm not going to go through this, but we can see it has existing data. Okay, so next, what we do is that we're going to go through the Azure subscription. Okay, so I have access to that Azure subscription here, which is a demo subscription. It's coming with that existing resource group, the Contoso resource group, with which is being deployed on a location East US2. So all of my resources will be deployed against that specific region. Okay, remember that the region may not be the same for you. So for all of my demos, for this exercise, I'm going to be deploying all of my endpoint against that specific location. Okay, so let's go ahead. So what I want to do, prior to the deployment for the SQL database, what we could check is the resource provider. Because we're doing a migration in Azure, there's multiple resource provider being used. So under the settings, we have the resource provider. Okay, and what we are doing as part of this demo is a data migration. Okay, and we can see it here that I have my resource provider for data migration, which is already registered. This is good. If yours is not, you can just select it, register on the resource provider. It's going to take a few minutes in order to be registered, and after that, you will be able to proceed to the migration. Okay, but without that resource provider, you would not be able to do it. Okay, now let's go back to the creation of our SQL database. So let's do it. And I create as we did before. So this is nothing new so far. We're going to create a SQL database. So we're pointing to a specific subscription. We have the resource group. Okay, I'm going to point to the existing one. I'm going to enter the database name. Be mindful that if you're doing the lab here, has to be using some specific names. So I'm going to be using those. If not, it may be blocked by policy. Okay, so I'm going to keep that one here. Same for the database server. So the logical server where the database is running from, going to be using that specific name as well. Okay, I need to change its location. As mentioned, I'm going to be deploying East US2. Here you go. Okay, for authentication, because we will need to connect to the database, right? So I'm going to be using the SQL authentication. I'm going to call it the SQL admin. Pay attention that you should remember the admin username, the admin login, and its password, as we'll reuse it in a few minutes. All right, so my password are matching, and I was able to speak at the same time. So look at this, I'm getting better. All right, let's continue. So next, scroll up a little bit. Here you go. Do we want elastic pool? Well, no, right? For intent for this demo, I'm going to be deploying a single database. Okay, so do I need elastic pool for a single database? Well, potentially no, right? We explained this earlier as well. Workload environment, I'm going to keep the production. Compute and storage, Let's click on it. We're going to change it. As previous demo, what I'm going to be doing, even though we have multiple options, I'm going to be using the basic DTU. Okay, remember, this is the beginning of the, let's say, the life cycle for this application. We're just going to do the migration here. Potentially, do we need a lot of space, a lot of storage? Maybe not, right? Or maybe not a lot of compute power as well. But if later we want to increase that number, well, we can as well. Remember, those are managed solutions, so it's something we can do after the fact as well. Okay, I'm going to click on apply for this one. Okay, here we have geo redundancy for the backup storage. So all of the backup will be replicated against another region. This is fine. All the other settings, we're going to do some modification against the other settings, but not yet. So let's go ahead and create it. So we're going to look for validation first, and if correct, we're going to proceed to the deployment. All right, perfect. And the deployment here will take a few seconds. It's deploying multiple resources, as we have seen before. All right, and after that, what we're going to be doing is we're going to modify these. We're going to configure the access to the Azure SQL database. And then after that, we're going to spend almost the remaining of our time in the Azure Data Studio. All right, so our deployment is now complete. So let's have a look. You can see the server name and the database name is the same, right? So it's being asked by policy to do it. So that's why be consistent with the naming of the resource. If not, it may be blocked by policies as mentioned. Okay, so again, we have the server name, so I'm going to copy it. And what we want to do here is to configure the access because we're going to access it through the Data Studio. So as we have done on previous demo, I'm going to select the network, selected network, and then I'm going to enable client IP and allow Azure services and resources to access this server. All right, once being saved, we can now go and connect to the Azure SQL database in Azure Data Studio. So let's open it. And what we're going to do, we're going to create a new connection. Okay, so again, I'm connecting to that Microsoft SQL Server. I saved the server name proactively here, so I have it there. Would I use authentication type Windows authentication? Well, no, I'm going to be using the SQL login, okay, with the admin login provided. So my side, I use the SQL admin and the password. Perfect. And then we can connect. All right, so you can note that for this demo, what we've done, we created this this database server which has that database, but the database has nothing in it, right? It's just empty database which has nothing in it, which is going to be interesting. Why? Because we're going to do the migration from that existing database that we have created on the Management Studio here. All right, in order to do this, what we need to have is the extension for the migration. Okay, so on the Data Studio, we're gonna go at the bottom left here, we have the extension. We're gonna go and then we're gonna search for the Azure SQL migration. Okay, we have that migration is not being installed yet, so I'm gonna be installing it. All right. We can see it's installing, and it is now being installed. Okay, it's gonna take maybe a few seconds before I can see the migration tab here. But let's go, in the meantime, let's go ahead. What we're going to do is create a new connection. Now, we have connected through the Data Studio. We have connected to the database on Azure, but now let's connect to the database that we have on-prem. okay, the one that I installed on the Management Studio. So again, I'm pointing to that Microsoft SQL Server, which is good. Now I'm going to go ahead and go back on our Management Studio, right? This is the one I want to connect to. So here is my server name. I need to point to that specific name here. Okay, so let's go ahead and type the name, SQL1. Okay, I'm going to switch back from SQL login to Windows authentication, which is the one I'm leveraging for that specific server name. Encryption, I'm going to move it to optional, and we're going to connect. All right, perfect. So we can see that, here you go, I have my tab here for the Azure SQL migration. So we can see that that database is there, right? Potentially with all our tables and so on. So this is what we want to migrate from that specific server. We want to migrate all of those tables to the new database server that we created on Azure. Okay, so that's the goal of this demo. So what do we need to do? Well, let's go ahead. We just need to go on the Azure SQL migration. And remember, this is a step-by-step approach. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Migrate to Azure SQL, and we can see all the steps that has to happen. Step number 1, select the database for assessment. Okay, we have only one, but we need to select it. Okay, let's continue running the assessment. Going to provide the assessment summary and the SKU recommendation. Okay, we can see we have information for SQL Server running on Azure VM, our IaaS approach, or our PaaS solution, both for the Azure SQL database and also the Azure SQL Managed Instance. Let's continue. Looks that all of them are supported with no blockers, which is good. Gonna continue. And as part of our demo, we are going to select the Azure SQL database, right? That's what we have created. So now I have already pre-selected here the database that we want to migrate. We have that green flag here that is ready. So that's the readiness of our database. There is no findings, there is no blogging. So we have all the potentially the green light against those here, right? We have some warnings here because of the authentication. On one side, we're using the Windows authentication, and on the other one, we're using the SQL authentication, right? So that's the reason why I have those flags. But again, doesn't matter because we have the access on both here, right? I'm only migrating the data and the schema as part of this demo, not the login itself, right? So let's continue. Now what we have here on the step number 4, the Azure SQL target, we need to link the account, right? It's making sure that through the migration that we actually have access to the Azure subscription. Okay, so I'm going to click on link account, add an account, right? Potentially it's going to do the lookup with the existing account that I'm logged in with. Okay, so if you have multiple, well, you need to select the one you want to connect with. Okay, once it's been logged in successfully. Perfect. So I can go back, select the account that I want to choose, and we can continue. All right. So it's going to be looking up with the subscription ID, the location, the resource group that we have, the Azure SQL database server that we deployed, leveraging the username that we created. We just need to enter its password. All right. In order to connect to it. Connection was successful. Target database found 1, which is empty, right? So that's what we want to do. I have my target database name out there. Okay, so now we can continue. We can see the source database is this one and the target database is that one. Let's continue. Okay, now we need to have the Azure Database Migration Service. Remember that service that we mentioned prior this demo? It's going to be the account that's being used for that. Okay, there's none created, right? So let's create a new one. So I'm going to leverage this resource group that we have, and I'm going to call it the Migration Service 1. Okay, create. There's multiple ways on how to create it. We can either run it on another Windows machine, or in my situation, I'm going to be leveraging and setting up that self-hosted integration runtime on my local machine. Okay, this is where I'm running it. Okay, so what I want, execute the script. I'm going to open PowerShell, and it's going to take some time here in order to configure that migration service. Okay, so let's wait for this. All right, it looks that the migration service with the configuration of the integration runtime is completed. Let's wait for the authentication with it. All right, press enter to continue, and now we should be good to proceed with the other steps. I'm going to minimize this here. So we've done the implementation of the migration service here. Again, there's multiple ways on how to set it up. I've done one way, right? So let's do the lookup for it. I call it the migration service number 1. All right, let's refresh. And then it is now online. Okay, so once we have the migration service, which is the service that the migration will be leveraging in order to do the migration, then we can go and move forward to the step number 6. So let's go ahead. Step number 6 is for data configuration, data source configuration. So having the authentication against the source is something that is required, right? So on my side, I'm using that lab VM. So the password here would be the password that you can be leveraging for that lab VM, right? So I'm going to send the password for this one. And then what you need to do next is to select the table that you want to include as part of the migration. All right, so let's do it. I'm going to click on Edit. Okay, let's give it a few seconds to do the lookup here. Then I'm going to include the migration to the schema, to the target, and all the tables available. All right, perfect. So now that we can see the lookup, right? So available on target 0, missing on target we have 11 because we have no tables on the target server. So we want to select the migrate schema to target, and I would select all of the database here, right? I mean the tables within that database, which are already selected. Now unavailable for data migration, this is just the error log, because it's not something I need anyway. So I'm gonna update to make sure we include the schema. Next, what we need to do before we proceed to the last step, which is the migration itself, we need to run the validation. So let's go ahead. It's going to check the connectivity with the integration runtime, which is what we just configured. It's going to look at the connection from the source database and then the target database. Once everything is succeeded, we can proceed to the next step. Remember, those are all sequence of action. If one action is missing, you cannot go to the next one. For example, if there's an issue here, we will not be able to click on the next button here. Okay, but here we have all the green light, so we are good to proceed with the next option after the validation, which is going to be the start of the migration. Okay, so let's go ahead and click on Start Migration. Okay, starting the migration for our database. Perfect, that's what we wanted to have. I'm going to close this. Okay, so we can see migration in progress. Potentially you can go ahead and have more visibility as part of this one. It's going to take a few minutes as well here in order to get created, but potentially here we have the status. Okay, we can refresh to have more visibility as well based on what we're doing. So remember, as part of this migration, what we have done, so I'm going to let this run, right? But as part of this migration, we have created a SQL database on the Management Studio. Then that came with from an existing backup file. Then what we have done is created an empty SQL database on Azure. And then through the Data Studio, we've been doing the migration as we are doing right now. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed this lab, and I will see you for the next topic. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me in this video on migrating SQL Server workload to Azure SQL Managed Instance. We have covered key strategies and best practices, but also the technical steps required to successfully complete this migration. By now, you should have a solid understanding of how to leverage Azure SQL Managed Instance and the capabilities to enhance the data platform performance, scalability, and reliability. Remember, those tools and the method that we discussed, such as the Azure SQL Migration extension for the Azure Data Studio and the Data Migration Assistant, are critical for a smooth and efficient migration process. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in another module.